Hello everyone and welcome to the meta recap for the Oboro and Azusa patch. It seems like I'm releasing the meta recap later and later into the month with each edition, but I figured that since this patch is playoff period and followed by the off season which stretches into the next patch, it's still kind of acceptable, I guess. So for this patch, I've actually decided to only cover the new units and skip the usual overall meta coverage. And there are two main reasons for this. The first one being the ladder meta and playoff metas are considerably different, because during ladder, you're mostly playing a fixed style over multiple games and you're trying to tweak the box to try and have the best matchup against whatever you might face on the ladder. Whereas in playoffs, you have the information against your next opponent, and you can look at what they played in their previous games, how they draft, what they prefer to pick, and then so you can tailor your box and draft style according to that information. Which means the so-called meta would differ from game to game, even for the same player, and it's not really representative of the overall meta. And the second reason being we have a 3-week off season before season 11 starts, which is well, we have 2 weeks of off season left by now, and the ladder reopens halfway into the next patch, and I reasoned that it will be much more useful if I base the overall meta recap on that and supplement it with things that I've observed from the playoff after I finish the review, because right now the review I've basically only completed up to the top 16 games, so I'm left with top 8, top 4, and then so on and so forth. Also, the next new banner is kind of skippable in my opinion, at least for me, for my playstyle, and hence I don't see it affecting the meta too much at all, so no point doing the same meta recap twice for, the overall meta, not for the new heroes. So, to begin this video, first up, we have Oboro, and we're briefly gonna go through his kit and playstyle for those who aren't quite familiar with him. So, Oboro is a two-phase or time bomb style late game unit that does absolutely nothing but exist for the first few turns of the game, and the longer he exists in his first phase, the more buff he gets. In the second phase, he nukes his own troops, and anyone that fights him also has their troops made kind of useless outside of their troop effects. And finally, anyone that kills him in either of his phases will tank a single target AoE nuke, which sounds kind of weird because single target and AoE shouldn't belong in the same sentence, but here we are. As for how I actually feel about him as a unit, first time I tried to box him, I just pulled him like fresh off the banner and I tried to play him in casual games, is that he was way too fucking slow. I played him in 2 games before kicking him out of my box. The first one, my opponent left before he got to transform at like 3 or 4 stacks. He didn't even get to transform into his second phase. And then in the second game, I lost my entire team before he got to transform. So that's a horrible first impression, and because 80% of my games, the match is decided on turn 2 and ends on turn 3, so it's hard to justify him. And quite disappointed considering he was hyped up as a staple unit to pull. And after discussion with other players who have had some experience playing with him in casuals, I think that the problem mainly lies with the fact that he needs to be pretty high star to be usable. So why is that? So basically, these are the 2 reasons why. So Oboro's Death AoE is his weird way of contributing to the fight in the earlier turns before he transforms. And just to put some numbers out there, comparing the multipliers of his AoE at 4 and 6 stars at 2 and 3 stacks respectively. So damage increase doesn't exactly work like this, but this is just a rough idea of the difference in damage. For comparison, a magic build Ares can find kills on squishier units like mages and holy units with a 0.45 times AoE with a 25% damage increase from Ride the Wind, which will put him at roughly 0.56 times if we calculate it the same way, just to ballpark the value as we are doing for Oboro. So for Ares, he has a higher stat ceiling and a potential Scarlet Reaper proc between his AoEs, but Oboro can make up for that with his carbon fiber armor to supplement his, comparatively lacking attack stat. But you can just tell from the numbers that a 6-star Oboro at 2 stacks have a death AoE that hurts even significantly more than an Ares AoE, which is already quite lethal to squishier units. And the moral of the story here is that a 6-star Oboro can contribute to the early game in ways that the 4-star Oboro cannot, which is why my opinion could possibly change when I eventually shut him up, but I don't know if I'm gonna have space in my box by then. So moving on, some other things that I've noticed about Oboro. So his factions, which are Mythical, Origins, and Yeles, fucking sucks. Mythical and Yeles basically means the two Landai, Landiuses, whatever, forcing a rather slower box composition, because I don't believe in using Landius in the 1 tank 2 healer 13 DPS box. He's too squishy, doesn't provide enough utility for that kind of box, regardless of how many Yeles units you're running. And Origins can be solved by Die Hard, but it forces him to drop his 3C to bring his 2C. I forgot what the hell it's called. I think it's Calamity? Yeah. Which means that you can't stun if you fail a kill, which is quite significant sometimes. Sometimes you just use that skill to chip damage, even if you know you cannot kill, and then you just run backwards and then you stun someone. Strengthen isn't really a solution either, because you want the buff nearer to the end of his charging duration, which is basically, roughly turn 3 onwards, depending on when you intend to transform. And if you're relying on something like Tejas to do that, there's a very high chance your Tejas is going to be too busy to fulfill that role. She's probably gonna want to jump in and attack already by then. Also, his transform actually consumes 1 turn of buffs, so good luck with mass attack. You're gonna immediately lose it. And other than that, I find his bulk to be quite far from the unkillable behemoth that I've heard about. Specifically in his phase 2, I've seen a few games where he actually just dies hitting someone that can do counter damage to him, despite the fact that he neutralizes most of the troop damage. So even with the minus 90% troop damage, his hero health, even when inflated by his dragon transformation, which puts him at probably like 15, 16k and above, he still takes enough damage to die from certain counter attacks. Things like Werner, or if you're hitting a mage within their counter range even. And then, I'm not too sure if you really need an insanely good enchant for him to function that way. But I think for most people, you just drop that idea and just play him with double carbon and try to get value from his suicide death. And that's the way to go for him. And now we have Azusa. And again, we are going to briefly talk about her kit at a glance. She is a single target striker that has a pseudo revive, which is kind of similar to Himiko, but not exactly. And she can freely attack from the physical or magical side via her skills, so she can target the weaker side of her defense or magic defense, and it also ignores physical guard. I made this meme fucking long time ago, and I've also showed it on my channel, but yeah. So she doesn't give a shit about even CC White Phalanx tank or Autocrator physical guard. She just walks right through. Then actually she also ignores magical guard with her physical attack, but that kind of doesn't exist at the moment. It's like juggler, GDB, that's it. Then her main niche, other than her raw power, is her guard disable debuff from her 3C, and therefore her main function is actually to disable the tank, if not outright take 1 life from them. Unfortunately, she has very average legs by today, of course referring to her mobility and not her actual legs, because those are pretty decent, I would say. And then, her default threat range is 8, which is a little bit below average nowadays, unfortunately. And she kind of has to leverage that with her fake revive in order to initiate. It's kind of similar to Cherry, who also has a default threat range of 8 if you don't run the Scepter build. And then also very similarly attempts to leverage her bulkiness to position aggressively if she doesn't get the proc breeze. If you bring angels, you just park her on the terrain and very few things can kill her. So idea is kind of similar in that sense. So moving on. As for what I think about her, honestly I wasn't even planning on pulling her, because I wasn't convinced about her mobility. That's the main issue. But in the process of getting Oboro, I got 4 copies of her. So 5-star, might as well try her out for a bit. And honestly, she's not that bad. I wouldn't say I was impressed the same way as I was with Alicia. And she does have a fair bit of her problems, but a good Azusa game can look really good. And I wouldn't say it's too difficult to get. So the first point of contention that I want to discuss is her pseudo revive, which actually happens to be a bit worse than what I expected. So I'm just gonna text dump because I don't know how to do the animation for this. So in order to do so, in order to compare, I'll just put it side by side with Himiko, who has a similar mechanic. For Azusa, her talent only prevents half an attack as it does not affect the troop damage, so usually she will end up losing anywhere between a good amount to all of her troops, which matters a lot for her because troops represent half the damage for a single target unit, roughly. And in comparison, Himiko's talent completely negates the attack and even blocks certain effects from activating, which on top of my head I can think of is like Helena's 3C. The AoE portion of that attack just doesn't occur if you hit Himiko's talent. So on this point, Azusa's talent is worse by a significant degree, because she actually needs the HP. The second point of comparison would be how the talent is restored. Azusa restores it by making both a physical and magical attack, the hard soft thingy. Then when she ends her turn, when her talent is consumed, and she has the hard and the soft, then she restores the effect by consuming the buffs. And you can start this process even before you proc the talent. You can gain hard and soft before you lose your talent. So as for Himiko, you regain her talent by taking a set amount of actions. Nothing more, nothing less. This one isn't objectively worse for Azusa, as it's possible to, land the attack before losing the talent, as I mentioned. Then you tank a hit after that, you make a second attack, before second attack next action before you tank another hit. You heal up from a 3C, you're back to full health, you regain your talent, which means that you can probably tank another 2 hits, which ends up soaking up quite a good amount of tempo. She's basically tanking 3 hits at that point. The flip side of that is that her talent getting triggered before her first hit, in which case she better be right in front of the enemy so that she can start her attacks, get her value in. Otherwise she's kind of fucked for the rest of the game, because if her talent is proc, she loses 3 mobility from her talent, and then she becomes a 3 movement 2 range unit, which is absolutely horrid. You're just praying for a breeze proc so that she can do something, or you're hoping to keep her at the back so that she has a part to play in the end game. And as for Himiko, her talent will send her back to her nearest ally, where she just has to chill a bit before it comes back. Although sometimes, depending on the game state, she can get sent to a weird position and immediately get punished. TLDR, Azusa's talent has a much more punishing drawbacks, but has some potential to be more rewarding as well. So moving on, she's pretty weak to AoE and debuffs, which also happens to be similar to Himiko. She has built-in self-sustain, but most of it requires her to be actively attacking, which is not always possible. Not to mention debuffs like silence, unbuffable, heal block, mobility down, all being very devastating to her. Which is why I'm an advocate for the Mimir Hammer as her weapon, as compared to the Bone Crusher, which has its merits, like, dealing 5 debuffs so that CC White has to gamble the Dispel is pretty nice also, in my opinion. Then the Mimir Hammer can try to alleviate some of her sustained weaknesses. And if there's pressure on Azusa to initiate, mainly against tanks, because you want to make use of her ability to disable their guard or even outright dispel it, she will often require some type of mobility support in order to perform that role sufficiently. The usual suspects being TJS and IBC, since they can provide her with attack buff as well. Otherwise, if she's not lucky with her breeze procs, she just kinda gets zoned forever, because, majority of the metagame has more than 8 threat range. 8 is like the minimum, like Cherry and Azusa is the minimum for single target attackers. Most of it hits double digit, Die Hard has 10, IBC has 10, Wet Ham has fuck all. Even things like Werner has 9, like Apex Boot Werner has 9. Pepsi has 8, which draws. So yeah, 8 is kind of the minimum nowadays. And finally, for the above mentioned reasons, her game impact can be kind of inconsistent, as it mostly hinges on her ability to initiate with her talent intact, in which case there's a good chance she's gonna have a great game. Or if you accidentally gave a unit with a cheap hit and run tactic, things like Kyura, Cherry, these two are the main suspects on top of my head, Or, you know, something with summons, like CCY just summons a carry, just knocks her around a bit. And then, you know, that's gonna put her on the wheelchair for the rest of the game. And probably end up leading to a shit game because you can't get in range to hit anything without dying because you don't have your talent anymore. So on that point, I guess my initial suspicions were half correct, but it's more to do with her talent being a lot trickier to leverage rather than a blanket or mobilities kind of shit kind of thing. So it's mostly just the talent. Like when you when you lose the talent, it's kind of difficult to get her back into the game if she's not right in the middle of the enemy camp. So I think she definitely functions better if you try and cover her weaknesses in the box and in the draft. And on that note, we've reached the end of this video. I think I've covered most of the general strengths and weaknesses of these two units, and there's quite a bit of them. So there are by no means any metagame changes in my opinion. And I'm looking forward to test my Oboro at 6 stars much later down the line. He's like, I don't think he's even 5 stars yet at this point. And then hopefully I don't immediately kick him back out like I tend to do sometimes with like Kruger, you know. Or maybe I'll be proven wrong. So like I mentioned at the start of this video, this is the only part of the meta recap for this patch. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.